A lone man, a raging blizzard, and two starving wolves scratching at his door in the dead of night. But these weren't just ordinary wolves. They were begging, pleading for something that would change his life forever. He could have ignored them. He could have shut the door. But what he found when he followed them into the storm left him shaken to his core. A secret buried deep in the snow, a horror lurking in the darkness, and a truth so unbelievable it would haunt him forever. Why did the wolves come to him? What were they running from? And what shocking discovery was waiting beneath the ice? Stay with me, because this story is unlike anything you've ever heard, and by the time we reach the end, you'll never look at wolves the same way again. Jack was no stranger to the wild. For years, he lived by one rule: trust nothing and no one. He had spent his life tracking, hunting, surviving, but now he lived alone, hidden deep in the snow-covered mountains, far from the world he once knew. His only company? The howling wind and the distant cries of the wild. But on this night, something was different. On this night, the wilderness came to his doorstep, begging for help. The wind howled like a ghost through the towering pines, thick snow swirling in a violent dance outside the cabin. Inside, Jack sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames of the fireplace. The heat barely touched the cold that lived inside him. It had been years since he had shared this space with anyone. He liked it that way. No noise, no trouble, just the solitude of the mountains, the kind that kept the world at arm's length. Then it came, a sound that didn't belong, a scratching, faint at first, almost swallowed by the wind. Jack frowned, his grip tightening on the old mug in his hands. Maybe it was just a tree branch. But then it came again, louder, more insistent. He placed the mug down, his heart beating just a little faster now. No one should be out here. Not in a storm like this. He stood, every muscle in his body tensed as he moved toward the door. The scratching turned into something else. A low, desperate whimper, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. He hesitated, years of instinct warning him to be cautious. But curiosity had already taken hold. He reached out, unbolting the heavy wooden door, and pulled it open just enough to peer outside. His breath caught in his throat. Two wolves stood in the snow. Their fur was thick with ice, their bodies trembling violently against the wind. But what shook Jack wasn't their presence. It was their eyes. Not the cold, calculating eyes of hunters, but something else entirely. Desperation, pleading, fear. One of them lifted its paw, and the snow beneath it darkened with blood. The other took a slow step forward, lowering its head, as if asking, no begging. Jack had seen a lot in his time, but he had never seen wolves begging for help. He should have slammed the door, he should have turned away, but something in their gaze held him there, frozen in place. And then somewhere deep in the storm, came a howl, but not from the wolves in front of him. No. This one came from the darkness, and it was nothing like he had ever heard before. Jack's fingers twitched near the edge of the door, the cold biting at his skin, but he didn't move. The storm raged behind the wolves, yet they didn't run. They didn't attack. They just stood there pleading without words, their bodies shaking, their breath fogging in the freezing air. The injured one tried to put weight on its paw, but collapsed, its body slumping into the snow. Jack's instinct screamed at him. This wasn't right. Wolves didn't behave like this. They were survivors, born to endure. They didn't beg for help. If they were desperate enough to seek out a human, then something out there was worse than him. The wind carried another sound, a deep, guttural cry from the forest. Not a normal wolf's howl, not the kind that echoed through these woods every night. This one was wrong. Too long, too distorted. A sound that sent a chill through Jack's spine, that had nothing to do with the cold. The standing wolf's ears perked, its body stiffened. It knew. Jack exhaled sharply, gripping the doorframe as he glanced past them into the storm. Nothing but darkness, but something was in there, watching. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp fur, and something else, something metallic. Blood, and not just from the injured wolf in front of him. Jack had spent his life in these mountains. He knew every sound, every scent, every shadow that moved between the trees. But whatever was out there, hidden beyond the snow, was something he didn't know. The uninjured wolf took a step closer to him, a silent plea in its eyes. Jack clenched his jaw. His whole life, he had told himself he didn't care about people, about the wild, about anything but himself. So why couldn't he close the damn door? Jack's breath turned shallow, misting in the icy air, as he stood frozen in place. The injured wolf let out a weak, pitiful whimper, its body trembling, sinking deeper into the snow. The second wolf didn't move. Its gaze locked onto him, not in aggression, not in warning, but in something far worse: desperation. Jack had lived long enough to know when an animal was looking at him like prey. This wasn't that. This was different. This was fear. He stepped forward slightly, boots crunching against the frozen ground. The wolf's ears twitched, but it didn't flinch. Instead, it lowered its head, as if surrendering, as if silently saying, "Please." Jack's gut twisted. Wolves didn't surrender. They fought. They ran. They survived. He shifted his gaze past them into the blizzard, trying to see what they were running from. But all he found was a wall of white, thick snow falling in relentless waves. Nothing. Another long, drawn-out howl carried through the storm. But this time, it was closer. Jack's heartbeat pounded in his ears. The injured wolf flinched, curling in on itself, letting out a sound that wasn't just pain. It was pure terror. Jack clenched his fists. Every rational part of his mind screamed at him to shut the door, walk away, forget this ever happened. He had spent his life doing just that, not caring, not getting involved, letting nature take its course. But something about the way the wolves stood there, silently begging, trembling, waiting for his decision, made his stomach turn. Because for the first time in years, Jack realized he wasn't just deciding their fate, he was deciding his own. Jack's hand hovered over the door, his fingers twitching as if they had a mind of their own. Close it. Shut them out. Forget. That's what he should do. That's what the old Jack would have done. Survival meant keeping your world small, keeping your heart locked behind walls thicker than the snow outside. But the wolves didn't move. They just waited. The injured one barely had the strength to lift its head, but the other, it held its ground, staring at him like it already knew the answer. Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Why him? Why now? For years he had pushed the world away, convinced himself that he didn't care. But as he looked at them, two creatures who should have feared him, who should have run from him but instead came to him for help, he felt something stir in his chest. A crack in the walls he had spent so long building. Another howl sliced through the storm. Closer this time. The wolf's ears twitched, its body tensing, but it didn't turn. It just stared at him, waiting. Jack clenched his jaw, then sighed. Damn it. He stepped back, pulling the door wider, letting the warm glow of the fire spill out into the night. The uninjured wolf moved first, nudging the other gently before stepping inside. The injured one hesitated, its body shaking violently as it tried to stand. Jack crouched, reaching out before he could stop himself. The moment his hand touched the wolf's fur, he felt it, bones too sharp under its thick coat, the tremble of something that had been holding on for too long. The wolf didn't resist. It just let him. Jack lifted the weight into his arms, standing with a grunt as he stepped inside, kicking the door shut behind him. Whatever was out there, whatever had sent these wolves to his doorstep, he would deal with it later. For now, all he knew was this. He had just broken the one rule he had lived by for years. He had let something in. The warmth of the cabin hit the wolves immediately, their bodies still trembling, their breath coming in short, uneven bursts. Jack set the injured one down near the fire, watching as it curled into itself, exhausted beyond reason. The other wolf didn't move away from the door. It turned back, ears perked, muscles tense, staring at the wooden frame as if it expected something or someone to follow. Jack felt it too, that lingering unease that crawled along his spine like a warning he didn't fully understand yet. He had spent years in these mountains, learned to trust the unspoken language of the wild, and right now that language was telling him, this wasn't over. His fingers hovered over the bolt, then locked it shut with a sharp click. Whatever was outside, it wasn't getting in. The uninjured wolf exhaled, finally stepping away from the door, but not toward the fire, not toward comfort. Instead, it moved to Jack, its piercing gaze locking onto his own. Jack stiffened. Wolves don't look at humans like that. They watch, they observe. But this was different. This wasn't just survival, this was trust. And trust in Jack's world was always dangerous. Jack had seen injured animals before. He had seen fear, rage, survival instincts taking over. But this was something else. The injured wolf barely moved, curled near the fire, its breathing shallow but steady. The other one, though, it wasn't acting like a normal wolf. It didn't pace or sniff or inspect its surroundings like any wild creature would. Instead, it watched him. Jack ignored it at first, kneeling beside the injured one, assessing the wound. Blood had clotted thick around the fur, but the gash was deep, too deep to be from a normal fight. His fingers brushed against something rough, and his stomach twisted. Scar tissue. This wolf had been wounded before. Many times, he exhaled sharply. What the hell had these wolves been through? A low rumble made him pause, not a growl, something softer. A warning. He turned his head slightly, meeting the uninjured wolf's gaze. It was still staring, eyes flickering between him and its injured companion. Not threatening, just watching. Jack swallowed. This wasn't aggression. This was something else, and it made him wonder, who were these wolves really running from? Jack reached for an old rag, soaking it in warm water before pressing it gently against the wolf's wound. The moment the cloth touched its fur, the wolf flinched, a low whimper escaping its throat. The sound hit Jack harder than he expected. It wasn't just pain, it was exhaustion. Surrender, like this animal had been fighting for too long, running for too long, and now it didn't have anything left. Jack had seen wounds like this before, not just from animal fights, from something worse. He carefully parted the matted fur, his fingers grazing the rough ridges of scar tissue beneath the fresh injury. Not just one, dozens. Old wounds, deep ones, too many for a wild wolf. His stomach tightened. This wasn't normal. The wolf let out a slow exhale, not pulling away. It was allowing him to help, trusting him. Why? Jack didn't realize how hard he was gripping the cloth until the other wolf let out a quiet whimper. He glanced up. The uninjured one was still watching, its gaze unwavering, protective. Jack had spent most of his life not caring, not getting involved. He wasn't a rescuer, he wasn't a hero. But as he looked at the scars beneath his hands, he felt something shift. Whatever had done this to these wolves, it wasn't finished. And that meant Jack had just made a very dangerous choice. Just as Jack finished cleaning the wound, the fire crackled, sending flickering shadows across the cabin walls. The storm outside had grown heavier, wind screaming against the wooden frame. But through the chaos, another sound cut through the night, low, distant and unnatural. Jack froze. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the wolves. The uninjured wolf's ears snapped forward, its entire body stiffening. The injured one let out a soft whimper, shrinking closer to the fire. Fear, not pain, not weakness, fear. Jack's pulse hammered. He had spent years in these woods, long enough to know every call, every rustling branch, every living thing that roamed these mountains. But this sound, it didn't belong. It wasn't the deep, rolling howl of a lone wolf calling its pack. It wasn't the frantic cry of an animal in distress. It was slow, wrong, a distortion of something that should sound familiar, but didn't. His grip on the bloodied rag tightened. The wolves had come here for a reason. Not just because of the storm, not just because of the injury. They had been running. Jack turned toward the door, heart pounding. He could feel it now, a presence lurking just beyond the storm, watching, waiting. And for the first time in a long time, Jack wasn't sure if his cabin walls were strong enough to keep it out. Jack stood there, unmoving, the weight of the silence pressing down on him. The storm screamed against the cabin, but it was the stillness inside that sent a chill down his spine. The wolves weren't just resting now, they were listening. The injured one trembled slightly, curling tighter near the fire, while the other remained rigid, eyes locked on the door. Its breathing was slow, measured, waiting. Jack had seen wolves in the wild before, but never like this, not afraid, not acting like prey. Something was out there, and it was hunting. Jack exhaled, rubbing a rough hand over his face. He didn't sign up for this. He wasn't the kind of man who let strays in, let alone wild animals with past scars and haunted eyes. But here he was, with 2 wolves in his cabin, an unknown threat beyond his door, and a choice gnawing at his gut. Trust them, or throw them out. The second wolf turned to him then, slowly, its gaze heavy with something Jack couldn't quite name. It wasn't pleading, it wasn't warning. It was acceptance, like it already knew what he would decide. And that was the part that scared him the most. Jack tried to ignore the weight in his chest, the feeling that something was pressing against him, unseen but suffocating. He had lived alone for years, and he liked it that way. No one to rely on, no one to disappoint, no one to save. But the wolves weren't acting like this was over. The injured one shivered in its sleep, paws twitching as if running in a nightmare. The other, it hadn't sat down once. It paced near the door, ears flicking at the slightest sound. Its body tense, ready, not to fight, not to run, to react. Jack clenched his jaw. He had seen this kind of behavior before. Something was coming. The wind outside shifted, no longer just howling. It carried something deeper, something crawling beneath the surface. The wolf suddenly stopped pacing. Its head snapped toward the door. Jack's stomach knotted. This wasn't just an animal seeking shelter. This wasn't just a stray looking for kindness. They had come here for a reason, and the reason was still out there. Watching, waiting, getting closer. Jack tried to convince himself this was nothing. Just paranoia. Just the wind playing tricks on him. But the way the uninjured wolf stared at him now, silent, unmoving, made it impossible to ignore. It wasn't fear in its eyes. It was urgency. The injured wolf let out a faint whimper, stirring slightly but too weak to move. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls, but the warmth did nothing to shake the cold settling deep in Jack's bones. Then, as if making a decision of its own, the wolf near the door stepped forward, not towards the fire, not towards its injured companion. Towards him. Jack tensed. He had spent his whole life understanding the wild, knowing the difference between instinct and intention. Wolves didn't just approach humans like this, not without reason. The wolf stopped inches from him. It didn't bare its teeth, didn't growl. Instead, it did something that sent a shiver through Jack's spine. It lowered its head, not in submission, in trust. In a plea, Jack swallowed hard, his pulse hammering. Whatever was outside wasn't just hunting them. It was coming, and this wolf was asking for his help. Jack exhaled, slow and controlled, but his chest felt tight. He had spent years making sure he owed nothing to anyone. He had survived by looking out for himself. Yet here he was, standing in his cabin, staring at a wolf that was waiting for his answer. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying something heavier than snow, something unseen, something listening. The wolf near the door flicked its ears, but didn't turn its head. It already knew. It had felt it long before Jack did. A cold knot twisted in his gut. He needed to know what was out there. Jack grabbed his coat, his rifle, everything telling him this was a mistake. But his gut, the same instinct that had kept him alive all these years, told him that if he didn't act now, he'd regret it. He pulled open the door. The cold slammed into him instantly, stealing his breath, but he barely noticed. The wolf darted past him into the night, its movements precise, purposeful, not running. Leading. Jack hesitated, glancing back at the injured one by the fire. Its breathing was slow but steady. It would make it. If he made it back in time, he stepped into the snow, closing the door behind him. Whatever was out here, he was about to find out. The night swallowed Jack the moment he stepped outside. The cold hit like a knife, slicing through his coat, the wind howling so loud it felt alive. The snow had thickened, swirling in blinding sheets, but the wolf ahead of him moved without hesitation, fast, deliberate, knowing exactly where it was going. Jack forced his legs through the knee-deep snow, his boots sinking with each step. What the hell was he doing? He didn't chase ghosts. He didn't follow wild animals into the unknown. Yet here he was, tracking a wolf into a blizzard, because something inside him whispered that if he didn't, he'd never know what haunted its eyes. The wind howled again, but this time, it wasn't alone. A sound rippled through the trees, low, guttural, unnatural. Jack's pulse slammed against his ribs. It wasn't an echo, it was close. The wolf suddenly stopped ahead, its body stiff, ears pinned forward. Jack slowed, trying to see what it saw. Nothing but snow and shadows. Then he felt it, that crawling sensation. At the back of his neck, that deep, primal warning that something was near, watching. Jack gritted his teeth, gripping his rifle. The wolf turned to him, eyes locking onto his, not in fear, in warning. They weren't alone, and whatever was out there had just found them. Jack's breath hung in the frozen air, his heartbeat pounding against his ribs. The wolf remained still, its gaze locked on something hidden in the storm. Jack squinted, forcing his eyes past the relentless snow, nothing but endless white and shifting shadows. Then he heard it, not a growl, not a howl, a whimper, faint, fragile, helpless. The wolf bolted. Jack didn't think. He ran after it. His boots crashed through the snow, legs burning, as he followed the wolf through the twisting trees, down a slope where the storm thickened. The wind shrieked, but the sound was still there, weak, desperate cries buried beneath the blizzard. Then suddenly, a cave, small, half-hidden beneath a mound of snow and ice. The wolf skidded to a stop at the entrance, sniffing frantically. Jack stumbled in after it, barely catching his breath before his stomach dropped. Inside, barely visible in the dim light, a litter of pups. They were small, too small, their tiny bodies curled together for warmth, but one of them wasn't moving. Another let out a soft, broken cry, pressing against the others, as if trying to wake them. Jack's throat tightened. This wasn't just a wounded animal seeking shelter. This was a mother, begging for someone to save her children. Jack knelt, his breath sharp in the icy air, his fingers tingling from the cold as he reached toward the tiny bodies huddled together. The wolf beside him let out a soft, urgent whimper, its eyes flickering between him and its pups. She had brought him here for this. He touched the first pup. Ice cold. Too cold. The tiny thing barely moved, its breathing shallow, ribs pressing through its thin fur. Jack's chest tightened. They wouldn't last much longer. Moving quickly, he scooped up the weakest one, wrapping it inside his coat. It let out the faintest sound, more instinct than strength, pressing against the warmth of his chest. Still alive. Barely. The mother wolf nudged another pup closer to him. Jack gathered them all, his arms full of fragile, trembling bodies. Too small, too weak. How long had they been out here, buried beneath the storm, waiting for a mother who had barely made it back to them? His throat burned. She had risked everything to bring him here, to trust him. Jack swallowed hard, ignoring the sting in his eyes. He stood, the weight of the pups pressed against his chest. The mother wolf let out a breath, stepping closer, leaning her head briefly against his leg. A silent thank you. A desperate hope. Jack adjusted his coat, tightening it around the pups. There was no time to waste. He turned toward the cabin, toward warmth, toward safety, but deep in the storm, something moved, and this time, it wasn't the wind. Jack tightened his arms around the fragile pups, feeling their tiny bodies tremble against him. They barely made a sound now, their whimpers weak, their energy nearly drained. If he didn't move fast, if they stayed out in this storm any longer, he shoved the thought away. They would make it. They had to. The mother wolf stepped beside him, her body tense but close. Jack had never been this near to a wild wolf before. Never like this. She wasn't afraid of him. That realization unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. She should have been. Instead, she pressed against his leg for the briefest moment, as if steadying herself or him. Jack turned toward the path back to the cabin, but then a sound cut through the wind. Low, slow, a deep, guttural growl that made the hair on his arms rise beneath his coat. Not the wind, not an echo. Something else. The mother wolf stiffened, her ears snapping forward, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Jack shifted his grip on the pups, scanning the tree line. Nothing but white and shadow. Then, in the distance, the trees moved, not from the wind, not from the storm. Something large shifted between them, its presence wrong, too silent, too deliberate, watching, waiting. The mother wolf let out a warning snarl. Jack didn't hesitate. He turned and ran, and this time, the wolf ran with him. Jack's boots pounded against the frozen ground, each step sinking deep into the snow as he clutched the pups against his chest. The mother wolf ran beside him, her body low, muscles tense, not just from exhaustion, but from fear. She wasn't just running, she was escaping. The growl still echoed in his ears. It had been low, inhuman, almost stretched, as if something was imitating a sound it wasn't meant to make. Jack didn't want to look back. He didn't need to. He felt it. The presence, the weight of unseen eyes pressing into his spine. The wind howled, and for a brief moment, it almost drowned out everything else. Almost. Then another sound, a howl, not from the mother wolf, not from the injured one back at the cabin. This was different, longer, warped, too deep. It didn't call for a pack. It didn't mourn. It warned. The mother wolf stumbled, nearly collapsing into the snow before catching herself. Jack gritted his teeth and pushed forward. They were close. He could see the faint glow of the cabin through the storm now, the golden light barely visible through the swirling white. He focused on that light, not on the thing moving through the trees behind them, not on the feeling clawing up his spine, screaming at him that if he slowed down even for a second, he wouldn't make it. The mother wolf let out a sharp bark, urging him forward. Jack didn't stop running, because if that howl was what he thought it was, the cabin walls might not be enough to keep it out. The cabin was just ahead, but every instinct in Jack's body screamed that he wasn't going to make it in time. The pups shivered violently against his chest, their tiny bodies barely moving. He pressed them tighter to him, shielding them from the biting wind. But it wasn't the cold that made his hands tremble. It was the sound, that unnatural howl still stretching through the storm, echoing in ways it shouldn't. Jack had hunted wolves before. He had heard their calls, the deep, rolling notes of pack leaders, the shorter yips of younger ones, the mourning cries of the lost. This wasn't any of those. This was wrong. The mother wolf's breath came in sharp bursts, her ears pinned back, her eyes locked ahead as she ran beside him. Not once did she look back. Not once did she dare. Jack knew what that meant. Predators only looked forward when they knew looking back was a mistake. A sharp shift in the wind sent a wave of snow rolling toward them, blinding him for a second. His foot caught on something, a hidden root, a buried rock. He didn't know. He stumbled, nearly falling, nearly crushing the pups in his arms. His heart slammed into his ribs as he fought to stay upright, and then silence. No wind, no storm, just nothing. Jack's breath hitched. The mother wolf stopped just ahead, body frozen, her fur bristling. The woods had gone still. Something was here, and whatever it was close. Jack's pulse thundered in his ears. His breath came in short bursts, fogging in the freezing air, but he didn't move. He couldn't. Not with the way the forest had fallen into unnatural silence. Not with the way the mother wolf stood frozen, every muscle locked in place, ears straining against the quiet. And then, The trees shifted. Not from the wind, not from the storm, from something else. Jack barely saw it. A blur of darkness weaving through the white, low, fast, too fast. It didn't crunch the snow. It didn't make a sound. His stomach clenched. He'd spent years in the wild tracking animals, knowing their patterns, their strengths, their limits. But this thing had no pattern, no sound, no rules. His grip tightened around the pups, his fingers digging into the fabric of his coat. They were too close to the cabin now to turn back, too far to feel safe. The mother wolf let out a low, sharp growl, her breath ragged, not aggressive, not threatening. The air grew thick, suffocating, pressing against Jack's chest. He had felt fear before, but this was something deeper, something primal. The kind of fear that didn't need reason, the kind that lived in the bones of creatures who understood when they were no longer at the top of the food chain. Jack's body screamed at him to run, but before he could take another step, the shadows moved again, and this time they were heading straight for him. Jack didn't think, he ran. The mother wolf bolted beside him, her body low to the ground, moving like a creature that had outrun death before. Jack pushed his legs harder, ignoring the burning in his muscles, the sting of the cold in his lungs. The pups in his arms barely stirred now, their small bodies frighteningly still, too cold, too weak. He had to get them inside. Behind him, the silence shattered. Something was moving. Fast, not the way an animal should. No crunch of snow, no panting breath, just a whisper of motion, a presence, like wind shifting between the trees, but carrying weight that wind never should. Jack didn't dare look back. The cabin was closer now. 20 feet, 15. The warm glow of the fire barely visible through the storm. Just a little more. A sharp sound cut through the air. Not a growl, not a howl, a clicking noise. Deep and unnatural, like bone against bone. Jack's stomach lurched. What the hell was that? The mother wolf barked. A desperate, urgent command. Run. Jack didn't need to be told twice. He lunged forward, slamming into the door with his shoulder, nearly collapsing from the impact. The latch stuck for half a second, too long. He ripped it open, stumbling inside as the mother wolf shot past him. The moment she was through, Jack slammed the door shut, locking it in place. His breath came in sharp, painful gasps. For a second there was only silence. Then, a thud. Something hit the cabin wall. Not hard, not frantic. Deliberate, testing, waiting. Jack's hands clenched into fists. The wolves had come to him for a reason. Now he knew why. Whatever was out there wasn't leaving. Jack pressed his back against the door, his breath ragged, heart slamming against his ribs. The mother wolf paced beside him, ears flicking, eyes locked on the door as if she expected it to burst open at any moment. The thud came again, soft, testing. Jack swallowed hard, forcing his hands to move. Lock the door, secure the windows, keep whatever was outside, out. His fingers fumbled with the wooden latch, sliding it into place, but the unease in his gut told him it wouldn't be enough. So the mother wolf let out a low growl, stepping away from the door, her nose flaring as she sniffed the air. Jack followed her gaze to the frosted window. His stomach clenched. A shadow moved just beyond the glass. Too tall, too broad, not human, not animal. The injured wolf near the fire let out a weak whimper. Jack turned, his throat tightening as he saw the pups barely breathing in his coat. No time, they needed warmth. Now, he rushed to the fire, carefully pulling them out, placing them near the heat. The mother wolf followed, sniffing them, nudging them closer. A soft whine escaped her throat, something heartbreakingly close to a mother's plea. Jack clenched his fists. He wasn't going to let them die. Then, another sound outside. A slow drag against the wooden walls, like something with claws. Jack reached for his rifle. Whatever was out there wasn't leaving, and now it knew exactly where he was. Jack's fingers tightened around his rifle. His pulse thundered in his ears as the dragging sound outside continued. Slow, deliberate, too knowing. The mother wolf let out a sharp exhale, her body tense, ears flicking toward the door. Jack took a slow step toward the window, careful not to make a sound. Whatever was outside wasn't in a hurry. He wiped the frost from the glass, peering out into the night. The storm had softened, the wind no longer howling, but the silence was worse, much worse. Then he saw them, the tracks in the snow. At first they looked like wolf prints, scattered and deep, but something was off. The spacing was wrong, the shape distorted. Some prints were large, others smaller, but they all led toward his cabin, toward his door. Jack's stomach clenched. These weren't tracks from something chasing, they were tracks from something that had been circling, watching, waiting. The mother wolf let out a low whimper, stepping closer to the window. Jack exhaled slowly. Whatever had been following them wasn't gone. It was just out of sight. Jack stepped back from the window, his grip firm on the rifle, his gut twisted. This wasn't just a threat, it was a message. Whatever was out there wasn't trying to break in. Not yet. It wanted him to know it was there. The mother wolf let out a low, uneasy whimper. Jack glanced at her. She wasn't looking at the door or the window anymore. She was looking at the walls. His pulse spiked. She knew something he didn't. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the room. The injured wolf stirred slightly, barely conscious, and the pups, though closer to the warmth, still weren't moving as much as they should. Jack had to focus, keep them alive, keep them warm. But the uneasy pull in his chest wouldn't let go. Then, a soft creak. Not from the door, from the roof. Jack's breath stalled. No, that wasn't possible. His cabin was reinforced, built to withstand the worst storms these mountains could throw. But now, as he listened, he heard it. A slow shift, almost like pressure settling in, like weight. The mother wolf backed up, pressing against the pups, her ears twitching. Jack didn't want to look up, but he had to, because whatever had followed them wasn't at the door anymore. It was above them. Jack stood frozen, his pulse hammering in his throat. The soft creak above wasn't the wind. Something was up there. The mother wolf pressed herself lower to the ground, ears flattened, eyes flicking between the ceiling and Jack. She knew. This wasn't new to her. She had heard this before. Jack forced himself to move, every step slow, deliberate. The fire crackled behind him, but it felt distant, its warmth doing nothing to stop the cold curling in his gut. His hand tightened around the rifle as he stepped toward the center of the room, directly beneath the sound. Silence. Jack held his breath, listening, waiting for any sign of movement. Nothing. For a moment he thought, maybe it had left, maybe the weight was just his imagination. Then a shift, a slow drag of something heavy, right above him. Jack's stomach turned to ice. That wasn't an animal. It moved too smoothly, too carefully, like it was listening, like it was thinking. The mother wolf let out a low, urgent whimper. Jack knew what she was telling him. They needed to move, now. But then the worst sound of all, a slow, deliberate tap against the wooden roof. Not scratching, not pacing, a single rhythmic tap, as if whatever was up there knew he was listening. Jack's fingers curled tighter around the rifle. His breaths came slow and measured, but his heart hammered violently against his ribs. The sound on the roof hadn't stopped. Tap, silence, tap. A deliberate pause. It was waiting. Jack's throat tightened. He had spent enough time in the wild to know what it meant when a predator took its time. It wasn't uncertain. It wasn't afraid. It was patient. The mother wolf let out a low whimper, glancing toward the pups. She wasn't protecting herself. She was protecting them. Jack's pulse spiked. That thing outside, it wasn't after him. It had followed the wolves. It had been hunting them before they ever reached his door. Another shift on the roof, slow, steady, like something adjusting its weight. The wooden beams above let out the faintest creak. Jack had built this cabin himself. Thick walls, reinforced roof. Nothing should be able to move like that up there. His fingers flexed against the rifle. Should he fire? Should he wait? Should he run? Then in the silence, a sound sent ice through his veins. A breath. Not the wind. Not an animal. Something breathing. Right above him. Jack didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't breathe. The sound above him. It was breathing. Not the slow, steady inhale of a resting animal. It was shallow, uneven, measured. Like it was trying to control it. Like it was trying to listen just as much as he was. His grip on the rifle tightened. His mind raced. No animal acted like this. A bear would have broken through by now. A wolf wouldn't climb. This was different. Another breath. Closer. The mother wolf let out a quiet whine, her body lowering protectively over the pups. The injured wolf by the fire barely stirred, too weak to react. They were relying on him. Jack's muscles coiled. He had faced threats before, but not like this. This wasn't something he could predict. It wasn't hunting the way normal predators did. It wasn't snarling or clawing. It was waiting. A shuffling sound, just above his head. The slow drag of something across the wood. Jack exhaled, trying to slow the shaking in his hands. It knew he was here. It knew they were inside. Then, a shift. The breathing stopped. For a long, terrible second, there was nothing. No movement. No sound. And then a single, deliberate knock on the roof, as if it wanted to see what he would do. Jack swallowed. His grip on the rifle, unshakable. The knock had been intentional, deliberate. Not a misstep, not a branch, shifting in the wind. Something was testing him. The mother wolf pressed closer to the pups, her breath shallow, eyes locked on the ceiling. She didn't move. Jack understood why. Predators knew when they were being sized up. The silence stretched thin, stretching his nerves along with it. It was waiting. Jack adjusted his stance, his pulse pounding in his skull. He had two choices: fire a shot and risk drawing it closer, or wait and see if it lost interest. Another knock, louder this time. Jack's jaw clenched. No, it wasn't losing interest. It was getting bolder. His eyes flicked to the window, but the storm outside had thickened again. If there was something out there watching, he couldn't see it. Then, in the quiet, something worse. A slow, deep inhale. Not from him. Not from the wolves. From above, a breath dragged in through unseen lips, as if savoring the scent of everything below, of him, of the wolves, of the fear in the room. Jack forced himself to stay still, muscles aching with tension. Whatever it was enjoying this. And then a voice, soft, almost human. Open the door. Jack's blood ran cold. It was mimicking. Jack's breath hitched. The voice wasn't right. It carried the shape of words, the weight of something familiar, but it was off. Too hollow. Too careful. Open the door. A whisper. A command. A test. The mother wolf let out a sharp, trembling growl, her body stiff, her ears pinned flat. She understood it too. This wasn't a request. It was bait. Jack forced himself to breathe. It knew he was inside. It knew the wolves were here. And yet it hadn't tried to break in, because it wanted him to choose. His fingers flexed against the rifle. He had spent years ignoring fear, training himself to trust what he could see, what he could fight. But this, how do you fight something that speaks in stolen voices? Knock, knock. His stomach twisted. The sound was closer now, and then the worst part. Another breath, slow and deep. And then, it spoke again. Jack's hands went ice cold. It knew his name. Jack's stomach turned to stone. It knew his name. He hadn't spoken since the wolves arrived. Hadn't whispered a single word. There was no way it should know, and yet it did. The mother wolf let out a low, warning growl, pressing herself between Jack and the pups. The injured wolf near the fire barely stirred, its body too weak, too drained. They couldn't run. Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry as sand. It wasn't leaving. Knock, knock. A slow, deliberate tap against the roof, testing him, waiting. Jack forced himself to move, inching toward the rifle he had set down, every instinct screaming at him to be ready. But for what? A beast, a man, something worse. Then a shift, a slow drag of weight across the wooden roof, making the beams creak. Jack's hands curled into fists. It was moving. Not away, not leaving, circling. A deep inhale, the sound of something breathing him in. Then softly, too softly, "You left me behind." Jack's blood went cold. Because that voice, it wasn't just mimicking. It sounded like someone he knew. Jack's breath came slow, controlled, but his body wasn't. His hands trembled. His heart pounded against his ribs. He knew that voice. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. "You left me behind." The mother wolf's growl deepened, a guttural warning, her fur bristling. She sensed it too. Jack swallowed hard. His past was dead and buried. No one was left. No one who could be out there in the cold, whispering his name from the roof of his cabin. But the voice, it was familiar. Another shift above him, weight moving carefully, calculating. Jack forced himself to keep breathing. It wanted a reaction. It was waiting to see if he would break. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, but he barely heard it. All he could hear was that voice, a voice he hadn't heard in years. A voice that belonged to someone who was supposed to be dead. Then, another knock. Slow, closer. Then, a whisper through the wood. "Why did you leave me, Jack?" Jack's chest tightened, because the voice was his brother's. The brother who died 10 years ago. Jack's grip on the rifle turned white-knuckled. His brother was dead, had been for 10 years, buried deep beneath frozen earth, lost to a winter even crueler than this one. And yet, his voice was on the roof. The mother wolf pressed lower, a deep, rumbling growl vibrating through her chest. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the cabin walls, but Jack felt no warmth. Only ice, only dread. Knock, knock. His name came again, softer now, almost pleading. Jack. Jack's breath stilled. That wasn't his brother. It wasn't anything human. He forced himself to remember, to anchor himself in reality. His brother was gone. He had been there when it happened. He had seen the cold take him, had felt the grief tear through him. Nothing could bring him back. Another slow scrape across the roof. Then, a whisper so quiet he almost missed it. "You didn't even bury me." Jack's stomach twisted violently. No, that wasn't true. He had buried him. He had, but doubt crept in, slow and poisonous. Hadn't the storm been too strong? Hadn't the ground been too frozen? He had tried, hadn't he? The weight on the roof shifted again. The voice, it was too knowing. Jack gritted his teeth. This was a trick. It had to be. But when the next knock came, softer this time, almost gentle, Jack wasn't sure anymore. Jack's chest tightened. His mind screamed at him, "Don't listen, don't let it in." But the voice was inside him now, burrowing deep like the winter cold, curling around old wounds he thought had healed. "You didn't even bury me." He could still see that night, frozen in time like the ice that had taken his brother's body. The blizzard had been relentless. They had been trapped. No way down the mountain, no way to call for help. His brother had been shivering, then shaking, then still. Jack had tried, hadn't he? The mother wolf let out another low growl, snapping Jack back into the present. The injured wolf near the fire stirred weakly, its breath shallow but steady. They were all still here. They were alive. But the thing on the roof, it wasn't leaving. Knock, knock. Jack swallowed hard. He knew what it wanted. It wasn't just trying to break in, it wanted him to break first. Another slow whisper seeped through the wood, curling into the warmth of the firelight. "You left me to the snow, Jack." Jack clenched his jaw, his pulse roaring in his ears. He had buried him. He had. But the storm had been so strong, the ground too frozen. He had done what he could, hadn't he? Hadn't he? His grip on the rifle trembled, because if that wasn't true, then what had he left behind in the snow? Jack's breathing was slow, controlled, but inside he was unraveling. The voice wasn't stopping. It wasn't losing interest. It was patient, peeling back layers of his past, whispering into the cracks he had spent a decade sealing shut. The snow was too high, wasn't it? Jack's pulse spiked. No, he had dug. He had tried. But the truth sat heavy in his chest. The storm had been merciless. His hands had gone numb, his body weak, the cold biting into him as he fought against a mountain of ice. And then his brother had stopped breathing. Jack had screamed his name, shaken him, begged him to wake up, but the storm had taken him, and when Jack had tried to bury him, the ground had been too hard. The mother wolf's growl deepened, sharp and protective. Jack blinked, forcing himself back into the present. He wasn't on that mountain anymore. He was here, alive. But then another whisper, "You didn't bury me, Jack." A sharp knock rattled the roof. Jack gritted his teeth, his grip on the rifle unsteady, because for the first time since this started, he wasn't sure if the voice was lying. Jack's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles burning white, and he couldn't let this get inside his head. Whatever was on the roof, it wasn't his brother, it wasn't real, but it knew. It knew things no stranger could ever know. The storm, the snow, the way Jack had stayed beside his brother for hours, screaming his name into the wind until his throat was raw. "You didn't bury me, Jack." His breath came faster now, shallow. He had tried. God, he had tried. But the ground had been frozen solid, his fingers numb and useless, the storm swallowing every ounce of strength left in him. And in the end, Jack's stomach twisted. Not because he wanted to, because he had no choice. The fire popped, sending a flicker of light across the room, snapping Jack back to the present. The mother wolf pressed herself against the pups, her body coiled, ready to strike. She wasn't fooled. She knew what prey looked like. But Jack, he wasn't sure anymore. Another breath seeped through the wooden ceiling, slow and measured. Then softly, too softly, "Why did you leave me, Jack?" And this time, he didn't have an answer. Jack squeezed his eyes shut, his fingers gripping the rifle so tightly his hands ached. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the voice, his brother's voice, was everywhere. "Why did you leave me, Jack?" His breath came faster now, clouding in the cold air. His mind kept dragging him back to that night, to the weight of his brother's body in the snow, to the way his hands had bled trying to dig into frozen earth. He had wanted to bury him, but he couldn't. The storm had screamed around him, tearing at his clothes, numbing his limbs. He had begged the ground to give, had punched the ice until his knuckles split, but the mountain had swallowed his brother whole. And in the end, Jack's throat closed. He had walked away, not because he wanted to, because he had to. The mother wolf let out a sharp bark, snapping him back to the present. The firelight flickered wildly. Shadows stretched across the walls. Another shift on the roof, a slow, calculated movement. And then the voice changed. It wasn't soft anymore. It wasn't pleading. It laughed. Low, cold, wrong. Jack's stomach lurched. Whatever was up there, it had never been his brother. Jack's breath stalled. That laugh, it crawled under his skin, slithering like ice through his veins. It wasn't his brother. It had never been his brother, but it had known exactly what to say, exactly how to sound. The mother wolf bared her teeth, her body coiled in a rigid stance of pure instinct. She wasn't fooled. She had known from the start. Another shift on the roof, a slow, deliberate scrape. It wasn't testing anymore. It was enjoying this. Jack's heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. This thing, whatever it was, had been following the wolves before they even reached his cabin. It had hunted them through the storm. It had circled his home, and now it was trying to unravel him. Jack clenched his jaw. No, he wouldn't let it. His hands steadied on the rifle, his pulse slowing. It wanted him afraid. It wanted him to break. He wouldn't. Another laugh, lower this time, mocking, satisfied. Then it spoke again. "I see you, Jack." Jack's stomach twisted violently, because this time, the voice wasn't coming from the roof. It was at the window. Jack's blood turned to ice. It was at the window. The mother wolf let out a snarl, stepping in front of the pups, her body rigid with tension. Jack's hands tightened around the rifle, but he didn't move. He couldn't. Something was watching him, right there, beyond the glass. Slowly, too slowly, he turned his head. The fire flickered, casting weak light across the room. But outside, the night was suffocating. Snow clung to the edges of the window pane, swirling in the wind. At first he saw nothing. Then a shape, a shadow just beyond the frost. Still, waiting. Jack's breath came slow and measured. It wasn't pressing against the glass. It wasn't trying to force its way in. It didn't have to, because it was watching. And then it blinked. Jack's stomach lurched. Two pale eyes, milky and wrong, staring directly at him. Not wolf eyes, not human eyes, something else. And the worst part, it was smiling. Jack's pulse thundered in his ears. The thing was smiling, not with its mouth, with its eyes. Those pale, unnatural eyes didn't shift or flicker, didn't react to the flickering firelight. They just stared, unblinking, unmoved, like it had all the time in the world. The mother wolf let out another low growl. But she didn't lunge, didn't charge. She knew better. Jack did too. Because you don't attack something when you don't know what it is. His fingers flexed against the rifle. His breath came slow, controlled. It wanted him to react. Then it moved. Not a twitch, not a step, a glide. 1 second, it was at the window. The next, it wasn't. Jack's stomach dropped. Where did it go? The mother wolf turned sharply, snapping her head toward the door. Jack followed her gaze, his body tensing. Was it trying to get in? But no, there was nothing. No sound, no knock, just silence. And then a whisper, not from the window, not from the roof, from right outside the door. "Let me in, Jack." Jack's breath stalled, because this time, the voice wasn't his brother's, it was his own. Jack's body went rigid. His own voice had just spoken from the other side of the door. The mother wolf's growl deepened. Her body coiled tight, ready to strike. Even she knew this was wrong. Jack's hands trembled against the rifle. His mind raced, screaming at him to find an explanation. Echo, a trick of the wind. But deep down, he knew better. This wasn't nature. This wasn't something he could rationalize. Another whisper, just beyond the wood. "Jack, let me in." Hearing it once had been horrifying. Hearing it again, soft, patient, expectant, was unbearable. Jack forced himself to breathe. But every inhale felt like swallowing glass. He needed to move. Do something. But his legs wouldn't cooperate. Because what if he did open the door? And then the latch moved. A slow, delicate shift. Jack's pulse stopped. The lock didn't shake violently. It didn't rattle like something forcing its way in. It was careful, precise, like someone who knew exactly how to open it. The mother wolf let out a sharp, warning bark, and then a breath from the other side of the wood. Close, too close, and a whisper, so soft it barely existed. "I'm already inside." Jack's breath turned to ice in his throat. "I'm already inside." The words didn't come from outside the door. They came from behind him. The mother wolf whipped around, teeth bared, a snarl ripping from her throat. Jack spun instinctively, his rifle raised, his heart hammering like a war drum. But nothing. The cabin was exactly as it had been. The fire still flickered. The injured wolf still lay near the warmth, barely stirring. The pups hadn't moved. And yet he wasn't alone. He felt it. The weight of something standing just behind him. Close enough to touch. Close enough to breathe against the back of his neck.
Jack's stomach twisted.
This wasn't possible. He had locked the doors, the windows. Nothing had come in. So why did the air feel different? Why did the firelight seem dimmer? The mother wolf wasn't looking at the door anymore. She was looking at the corner of the cabin. Jack followed her gaze, his fingers locking around the trigger. The shadows shouldn't have been that deep. And then it moved. A shape, tall, wrong, watching. Jack's breath hitched. Because the thing standing in the corner had his face. Jack's breath came in sharp, ragged pulls. The thing in the corner was him. Not a reflection, not a trick of the light. It stood there, too still, too knowing. A shape molded in the dim glow of the fire, its features stretched just enough to be wrong. The mother wolf's snarl deepened, her body lowering into a defensive stance. The injured wolf let out a weak whimper, barely able to lift its head. The pups huddled closer together, but Jack couldn't move. The thing tilted its head, just slightly, studying him. Jack gritted his teeth. No, this was impossible. He forced himself to look, really look. The eyes weren't quite right, too hollow, too deep. The mouth, a little too wide. And then, it smiled, not like a person, like something that had practiced.
Something that knew a smile was meant to be comforting, but didn't understand why.
Jack's grip on the rifle tightened. This was a nightmare. It had to be. Then it spoke. "You left me in the snow, Jack." His stomach lurched. The voice, it wasn't just mimicking him. It was saying something only he had ever thought. Something he had never spoken out loud. Something he had tried to forget. Jack's pulse hammered, because if it knew that, then maybe it really had been watching him all this time. Jack's pulse pounded in his ears.
"You left me in the snow, Jack."
The words hung in the air, heavy, suffocating. It knew not just what happened. It knew his thoughts, his guilt, the ones he had buried deep, the ones that clawed at him in the dead of night, when the wind howled too much like a dying breath. The thing in the corner took a slow step forward. Not fast, not threatening. It didn't need to be, because Jack was already frozen. The mother wolf let out a sharp bark, snapping her teeth at the air between them. A warning, a last stand. But the thing with his face, didn't flinch. It didn't blink. It only smiled wider. Jack's fingers twitched against the rifle, his breath uneven. His mind screamed at him to pull the trigger, to do something, anything. Then it spoke again. "You could have saved me." Jack's stomach twisted so violently, he thought he might be sick. No, that wasn't true. It wasn't true. He had tried, hadn't he? He had done everything he could, hadn't he? But the thing in the corner, his own face, twisted into something inhuman, only watched him, as if waiting for him to admit what he had spent 10 years denying. Jack's breath came in short, uneven bursts. His fingers were locked around the rifle, but his hands felt numb, distant, like they weren't his own. "You could have saved me." The words echoed through his skull, digging into places he had kept buried for 10 years. No, he had tried. He had fought against the storm, against the ice, against the very mountain itself, hadn't he? The thing that looked like him didn't move. It didn't blink. It only waited. Jack forced himself to swallow. This wasn't real. It was a trick, a nightmare given shape. But his body refused to believe it. His chest tightened, his throat burned. Because what if it was right? A flicker of movement, a slow tilt of its head. It knew it could feel his doubt. And then the firelight dimmed. The warmth in the cabin bled away, like the air had been sucked out of the room. Jack's pulse spiked. The injured wolf let out a weak whimper. The mother wolf's growl wavered. The thing smiled wider, satisfied. Because it wasn't just here to haunt him. It was here to feed. And Jack was giving it exactly what it wanted. Jack's grip on the rifle tightened, but his hands were shaking. The fire's glow had weakened, its warmth fading unnaturally fast. Not from the storm, not from the wind, from something else. The thing in the corner, the thing with his face, was watching, waiting, feeding. The mother wolf let out a sharp, warning bark, but even she was struggling now. Her breath came shallow, her body shivering. The injured wolf barely stirred. The pups trembled in the fading heat. Jack's stomach twisted. It wasn't just him. Whatever was happening, it was draining them all. The thing tilted its head again, just slightly, like it was curious, like it was enjoying this. And then, it took a step forward. Jack's breath stalled. It wasn't gliding now, wasn't lurking in the shadows. It was stepping into the firelight, and as it did, its face shifted. Not a change of expression, a change of shape. The mouth stretched too wide. The jaw tightened, then loosened again. The eyes, they weren't his anymore. They were something deeper, something older, something that had been here long before him. Jack willed his body to move, but his legs felt heavy, his mind fogged, and the thing, his mirror, his guilt, his undoing, kept coming closer. And this time, it didn't need to speak. Jack already knew what it wanted. Jack's breath came in shallow gasps. The fire was dying, not flickering, not struggling against the cold, dying. Its glow shrank with each passing second, the warmth draining from the room, from his skin, from his very bones. The thing, his reflection twisted into something monstrous, was moving closer. Its steps were slow, deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. Jack wanted to lift the rifle, wanted to pull the trigger, but his arms felt like stone, his body heavy, like something was pressing down on him, smothering him, stealing the fight from his limbs. The mother wolf tried to move, to snarl, but even she was faltering. Her breath came in short, weak bursts. The injured wolf barely made a sound. Jack clenched his jaw. It wasn't just fear. The thing was taking something from them. The fire dimmed further, casting longer, darker shadows across the cabin walls. And then, the thing smiled wider. Jack's stomach twisted. It was enjoying this. And then, for the first time, it spoke in his voice. "You're making this easy." Jack's breath stalled, because it wasn't just here to haunt him. It was here to replace him. Jack's pulse pounded, his breath turning shallow. "You're making this easy." The thing, his mirror, his imitation, was nearly close enough to touch. Its form still looked like him, but the edges were wrong. The skin too smooth, the movements too calculated. Jack tried to step back, but his legs felt slow, like the strength was being drained from them. The fire shrank further, its last embers flickering weakly. Soon there would be nothing left. The mother wolf let out a weak growl, her body swaying slightly. Even she was struggling to stay upright. Jack clenched his teeth. This was what it wanted. The thing didn't need to strike, didn't need to force its way in. It only had to wait for him to collapse under the weight of his own fear, and he was losing. The thing took another step, its too wide smile stretching further. Jack saw it then, the way its shadow moved wrong, not like a man's, like something crawling beneath the skin of a borrowed body. Jack forced himself to grip the rifle tighter. No, he wasn't going to let it take him. Then, it spoke again. "Just let go, Jack." A whisper, a command, a trap. Jack's breath caught. He could feel it now. The pull, something dragging him towards surrender. Because if he let go, it wouldn't just take his place, it would take everything he was. Jack's muscles strained, his breath shallow. Let go. The words weren't just spoken, they echoed inside him. A whisper curling through his thoughts, threading itself into his exhaustion, his guilt. His arms felt heavier, his legs weaker, like something unseen was wrapping around him, sinking into his skin. The thing took another step, its face stretching into something grotesquely human. Its smile never faltered. Jack swallowed hard. It wasn't just stealing his strength, it was unraveling him. The mother wolf let out a weak, broken growl, but it barely carried. She was losing too. Jack's chest tightened. If he fell, if he surrendered, what would happen to them? The injured wolf near the fire whimpered, his body barely moving. The pups shivered, their small forms pressed against each other. Jack's grip on the rifle trembled. The thing leaned in closer. It smelled like winter, like snow burying something deep, like a grave that had never been filled. Then, it reached for him. Slow, patient. Jack's stomach clenched, because if it touched him, it would be over.